Greetings and welcome here to study number 24 in the book of Acts. Today we're going to be joining Paul aboard a commercial grain ship as he's traveling towards Rome. It's a very different chapter in a lot of ways because this is a chapter about a journey in which it seems one of the more interesting things is the journey itself. Not so much even from a spiritual point of view, though there are overtones certainly of that, but because we see here ancient travel as recorded no other place in all of literature. What was it like to travel in those times, those ancient times, nearly 2,000 years ago? The year is about 60 to 62 AD, and Paul is under arrest. He has appealed to Caesar, and so he's being sent all the way from Caesarea, the coast of Israel, all the way across the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, Ionian Sea, all those kind of things, all the way to Rome. And he's going to be traveling aboard one of these ancient ships. So it's quite an interesting thing. We'll be seeing that the recorder of this is Luke. Luke is actually the one who wrote the book, of course. He also wrote the Gospel of Luke. But here he is also traveling with Paul specifically at this time. So it's firsthand we kind of narration from this man by the name of Luke. He is making his way towards Rome. I cannot help but think that all of us are making a journey. It's not toward Rome, it's toward a celestial kingdom, a kingdom that will be here on the earth when Jesus returns. But our journey is an interesting journey, isn't it? It's not easy. It's not smooth. It's rarely as predicted. In fact, I don't know if I know anybody who looks at their life after a number of years and said, this is what I envisioned. This is what I figured. Pretty much each person I know is traveling forward in a journey, hoping, wishing, trying to guide it, no question about that. But sometimes realizing that life is just tough and life takes turns, and yet God is in control of this whole thing. So it is very interesting. So life in its journey is difficult at times. Unexpected things certainly happen along the way. And sometimes the circumstances just absolutely seem wrong, but God is with them at all times. God is with the circumstances. God is with us, the traveler, at all times. He will bring us through, actually, to where he intends for us to go. This journey that we call life, all really designed by him, no matter what it looks like, no matter how painful, difficult, fun, enjoyment that it gives us, all designed by God. Before we get into verse 1, join me in a word of prayer. Father, we're all traveling on this road of life with its many pitfalls, with its many difficulties, with its many unforeseen circumstances. May we know that the goal is to trust you each day, each event, each circumstance of life, wherever it goes. So God, be blessed today. Bless each and every person who reads and studies with us. In Jesus' name, amen. We read in verse 1, and it was determined, and when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. So Paul was a prisoner, and he's turned over to this man by the name of Julius. We don't really know a lot about him. He's a centurion, so that means he commanded a group of men under him. And he's of the Augustus band, so that kind of identifies him with a group that we don't have a lot of familiarity with, but nonetheless is giving us details here. He's going to travel in a boat along the coast. That's the idea to begin the journey. They're going to transport him along the coast, working northward from where they are, up toward the north, so far as they can find a place where they're going to change ships into a bigger ship. So he's riding in what we might call a coaster. It travels along the coast. There are others, as we mentioned, like Paul, other prisoners on this journey. By the way, it is a bit late in the year for traveling, but nonetheless, they are in the boat, they're on their way. And entering, we read in verse 2, into a ship of Adramyttium we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. So the intention is to sail along the coast and then catch another ship. We're told here that they are on an Adramyttian ship, a ship that is registered or belongs to a port in Asia in Asia Minor called Adramyttium, and another traveler with them by the name of Aristarchus is making the journey. We read onward, and the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. This is kind of interesting when you think about it. This is a Roman centurion, a Roman soldier whose job it is to keep these prisoners. He actually gives Paul some permission to go visit with his Christian friends here in Sidon. Now, Sidon is just basically a one-day sail up the coast from Caesarea, and so Paul is given opportunity to just kind of go along with his own recognizance, I guess. Paul is being trusted here, and he's going to go and spend some time with his friends, probably have some food, pray with them, and so on and so forth. So Paul surely did that. Verse 4, and when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Well, if you haven't gotten a map, usually in the back of your Bibles, you can probably find one. This is Paul's journey to Rome. That's usually the title on it. Sometimes they put the first, second, third missionary journeys and the missionary trip, if you want to call it that, to Rome, all on one map. So if you get a chance, get a map and you can see what is happening. So they travel first northward along the coast of the Mediterranean to Sidon. Now their intention is to leave there and go basically westward because that's where Italy, that's where Rome is to be found. But they're sailing. And when you sail, you cannot go other than where the wind will allow you to go. Now, if you were traveling the other route from, say, Italy down to where the grain ships were that they're about to catch a ride on, it's about a 2-week journey, and the winds blow pretty nicely from Italy, from Rome, basically southward all the way to Egypt, where they have a lot of traffic with grain ships. And Paul's about to board one of these grain ships. And he's aboard this thing, but it cannot go where they would like to go, which would be basically west. So they try, but they can't. So what they do is there's an island there, if you look at it on your map, called Cyprus. And they sail under that because it says the winds were contrary. So they sail in what's called the lee, or the leeward side of that island, being protected by the island itself. And it says, and when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. So in the protection of the island of Cyprus, they make their way what we would call to the southern shore of modern-day Turkey, and they're going to move along there. And then we see what happens. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. So they were on this little coaster, as it's called. We don't know much about it, but we do know that this ship that they're about to get aboard is a freighter. It's really a freighter. It's carrying grain. There was a lot of grain that moved from Egypt, where lots of it was grown, to Italy, where not so much of it was grown. So grain was brought from North Africa, the area around the Nile River, Alexandria and all that kind of thing, and it would be brought all the way to Rome. The Roman emperors in those days provided basically two things to the Roman citizens. They provided them games and entertainment to watch, and they gave them food to eat. That was their basic idea of government. Keep the people well fed, keep them well entertained, and you have a happy society that doesn't cause a lot of crime or a lot of trouble. That's kind of what they did. Well, the bottom line is you had these grain ships that would travel back and forth between Rome and Alexandria, Egypt. So they could go rather directly on their southern journey, bringing with them, by the way, manufactured goods, pottery, metalworks, and all that kind of thing. Then in Alexandria, they would pick up grain and travel back with it. But they couldn't go directly, my point being here, that they had to sail with where the winds would take them. And these ancient sailing ships didn't have a lot of ability to travel against the wind. Modern sailboats have what's called Marconi rigging. You can see it all the time when you picture a sailboat. You usually picture a boat that has a mast and it has a triangular sail or two. These are wing-like sails, and you can actually sail quite a ways toward where the wind is coming. If a sailboat is pretty modernly designed, it can travel within 45 degrees of where the wind is blowing from, sometimes even up into the 30s. But back then, you had to kind of let the wind push you from behind. And so this idea of sailing had to do with where the wind was coming from. So you had to have a lot of knowledge where the wind would go, where you were at certain times. And so this is something that they just have to do. So their intention is to catch one of these grain ships. Now, the ship itself is pretty big. It's about 180 or so feet long. And it is about the size of the USS Constitution. If you've ever been to Boston, you can visit the USS Constitution, also known as Ironsides. And it's about that big. It's probably wider. It carries a lot of grain. And as we'll see later on in the chapter, it's going to carry 276 personnel, including a lot of passengers. And if you were a passenger in those days on one of these grain ships, you had to bring your own bedding, your own clothing, and all that kind of thing. And they didn't have cabins for you to live in while you made your journey. You actually had to live on deck. And it took several days, if not several weeks, or even maybe into the months to make such a journey, depending upon how the wind blew. You had to survive on deck, on the ocean, night and day. Now, personally, I have spent a lot of time boating the local coast here in Southern California, visiting the nearby island of Catalina, up and down the coast at various places to put in and put out a boat. Some of it sailing, some of it motoring. I can just tell you that one of the more tiring things about boating is when you're in a sea that's rough, or not even that rough, it is tiring to be on deck because the wind and the waves pitch your boat back and forth, up and down, heaving, twisting, dipping, and diving. Many times you have to be seated. Many times you have to be hanging on to something if it gets really rough. It's very, very fatiguing. In fact, quite a number of boats every year are lost because the people aboard get fatigued and they cannot hold on any longer, and they get knocked overboard or they fall overboard in fatigue. Then they find an empty boat drifting away. Well, my point is, it's not easy being on deck, but they would have well over 200, almost 300 people surviving on deck as this 180-foot sailing vessel would try to make its way. And when we had sailed over, verse 5, the Sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found this ship, a ship of Alexandria, sailing into Italy, and he put us thereon. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmone. So again, remember, they're trying to travel basically toward the west, but the wind is mostly coming from the west. And so they sail basically southward under Crete. Now, an island in the ocean there called Crete. And again, they sailed in the shelter. They sailed on the leeward side. If you read that word anywhere, it looks like it is leeward, and you'll hear people pronounce it, but sailors always say leeward side. And so they sailed on the leeward side over against that, underneath those islands. And it says, and hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lycia. So sailing along the southern part of Crete, they come to this place called Fair Havens. Sounds like kind of a nice place, but in reality, it's a place, all right, but it's on the southern part of the island, but it's not really a place where you can hang out. It's just kind of a place on the map more than anything. Now, when much time, we read in verse 9, was spent, when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. Paul is a prisoner, but Paul is going to speak out with some information. Now, understand this. It says the time was spent when sailing was dangerous. Well, the time of year was after the fast, and this puts it on the calendar for us in late September, early October. Normally, you wouldn't travel during that time because the sea conditions, the storm conditions are now beginning to stir. The Mediterranean, the Ionian, the Adriatic. I think the Ionian and Adriatic are the names of the same place. But the seas and the winds and difficult storms begin to brew quite a lot. So in general, you would know if you were a seaman that you had to make your trip during a certain portion of the year if you wanted to get there. Now, with the backdrop of that, you also have to understand this. Rome needed grain, and so they did offer bonuses to ships that made it to port during the stormy, wintry seasons of the year. So it's not that they all locked up shop and stopped sailing, but it's that you probably shouldn't sail because of the risk. Well, that's the circumstance here. Now, Paul is about to, as it says, admonish them. You got to say to yourself, who is he to admonish anybody? He's a prisoner. Here's what he said in verse 10. And said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading in ship, but also of our lives. Paul had traveled quite a bit, probably some of it prior to this on ship. He probably knew quite a number of things by his own experience, but we probably get the idea here that Paul knew something because he was a man by which the Spirit of God often talked with him, giving him sometimes words, sometimes he even had an appearance, a heavenly appearance, but sometimes just the things of the Spirit came to him. You know, as Christian people, that can happen where God speaks to you. God puts impressions upon you. Now, it's hard to tell when God does that. It's hard to learn when it's God. It's hard to know when it's not our imagination. It's hard to know when it's not our desires or our fears or a combination of all the above. It's hard to know when the devil and his dark forces are trying to give us false information. But Paul was kind of trained in spiritual things, and he had good understanding of godly things and godly messages that might come to him and through him, as they often did. It is something that we might consider endeavoring to be open to the Spirit, that we might hear from God. You know, I like to hear from God, and I'm sure you would like to hear from God, but I'm not so sure I always know how to listen. I'm not so sure I always know that the still small voice of God is somehow in the background of the noise. It's often not loud. It's often hard to hear because of my own desires, my own difficulties, my own wants, my own fears, and all those kind of things, and all the voices around me. It's not an easy thing. It's a thing of training. And I think if we're open to God, He does train us to hear His voice better. May God bless us all as we're patient and allow God to train us that we might understand better the things that are blowing and brewing around us, as God will often speak to us. Well, it says, nevertheless, in verse 11, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. I do not think that was a surprise. I mean, these were professionals, and the owner and the master, the pilot, the captain, whatever you want to call him, had a sense, probably having made this journey many times before, kind of figured it was a calculated risk to move onward, and he probably had plans to make it to a certain location, then maybe stop for the winter, that kind of thing. And so I'm sure they heard Paul, but kind of tuned him out. That would be what they would do, at least early on. You know, it would have been smarter for them to listen, quite frankly, but later on they will learn to listen to Paul. So for now, though, they're going to go with the professionals. Doesn't the world often like to go with professionals? You know, we have problems and we have difficulties. So often I hear people say, well, you need professional help. I don't even know what professional help really is, other than the fact that someone has had some kind of training. Someone has maybe some kind of a certificate. Someone has, though, what they really have, though, is a job where they get paid for helping you out. And I'm not so sure that that is really biblical in some respects. I'm not going to put it down because, you know, there are many good counselors and many good therapists and all that kind of thing. But I always wonder about it. And it seems, though, that the ones that I personally know, therapists and those who take money for giving sound Christian advice, the ones I know strangely, maybe it's just those that I know, but it seems like I wouldn't too often recommend them. But I would recommend sometimes that people would go to their pastors, go to their Christian friends that are experienced. Don't choose an inexperienced friend that's, not journeyed very far, but sometimes you can find those that have been there and had sound advice from those that are older. Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time kind of getting into that, but, Paul is a godly man, but they're listening to, quote, a professional. They would do much better listening to this godly man who'll give them free godly advice at this point in time. Well, it says that they didn't listen to the words spoken by Paul. Verse 12, and because the haven was not commodious, there's a word for you. The haven was not commodious, meaning it wasn't safe or convenient, okay? Convenient. Because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenix, or some translations will say Phoenix, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. So they have a possibility of going to this other place. It's only about 40 miles away. So it looks like it should be something they could do. But if you've ever seen the old TV show Gilligan's Island, the premise for the show was they were shipwrecked, but they originally departed upon a 3-hour tour. Now, this might have taken them more than 3 hours by calculation, but it is going to be a bit of Gilligan's Island because they're not getting to where they thought at all. So it's a haven that they're going to, and it's just not quite something that they're going to arrive safely in. Now we read next in verse 13, and when the south wind blew softly, that sounds good, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete. So on they go, and it looks like it's going to be fine, but doesn't the wording itself sound just a little bit ominous? As it says there, supposing that they had obtained their purpose. The wind is blowing softly. Well, verse 14, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. I got to tell you, when there's a wind with a name called Euroclydon, it doesn't sound very good. Now, some of your translations, if you're not following along in the King James, might say a northeaster, some kind of a northeastern storm. Let me read to you what a commentator said. They said, this word Euroclydon. Interpreters, they said, have been much perplexed about the meaning of this word, which occurs nowhere else in the New Testament. The most probable supposition, they say, is that it denotes a wind not blowing steadily from any quarter, but a hurricane-type wind, or wind veering about to different quarters. In other words, this direction, that direction, and every direction, back and forth. Such systems are known to abound in the Mediterranean and are now called levanters, deriving their name from blowing chiefly in the Levant, or eastern part of the Mediterranean. So this is what is happening. It's a big, strong wind. It's got a name, and it's not what they really want. They had a nice, soft, blowing wind, thinking that this is all they need. Instead, they got this hurricane storm blowing from all different directions, and that's what they now have to deal with. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. As we said, these ancient sailing ships didn't have these modern Marconi-rigged sails. So if the wind were blowing and you were getting hit by a very hard wind, what you had was not a lot of choice. You had to kind of, if you were there and you were going to sail at all, you kind of had to let the wind push you along where it wanted you to go. The idea being we got to make headway because we can't stay in this position because the ship is going to get pushed. So they position themselves so that the wind is at their back. And so what it does here is it says we let her drive. So that means they're just going to go where the wind is blowing. And it says, in running under a certain island, which is called Clara, we had much work to come by the boat. Well, they were dragging along what we would call today a skiff or a shore boat. It was a smaller boat that they pulled along behind them. And what they're really saying is, as we were driven along and as it was rough, we decided that we would get that small boat and put it on deck. though pulling it in as the ship tossed up and down and rolled right and left, we had a great deal of time putting this boat on deck. So they would have used manpower to do this. We read this island called Clauda. It is southwest, if you're following along on a map, southwest of Crete. Today, I believe they call the island Gonzo, Gonzo. And it's about 23 miles here from where they had started. And so they're just being driven along. It says, in which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. Well, all kinds of nautical things being described for us here. So they do get this smaller skiff, shore boat, if you will, aboard. Now, that boat would have been used to go ashore if you didn't want to bring your bigger ship ashore. It was also used to put out lines, to put out anchors and all that kind of thing. You could put the anchor aboard this boat, or you could put lines aboard the boat, and they would row out and fasten them to a dock or shore, those kind of things. Well, at any rate, they've gotten this boat aboard. So the next thing they do, as we read here in verse 17, is they use what they call helps. Now, these boats, these big boats, they were pretty big. They carried many tons of gear and wheat aboard them. But they were plank boats. They were made by planks being held together. And so as you had rough seas, the planks could flex. And as they flexed, you could allow water into the hold and into where the grain was being kept. Also, the very deck on top, same thing, made out of planks. So as the boat might flex under heavy seas, and because caulking was not always watertight, it's still not always watertight to this day on wooden sailing vessels made of planks. But water would seep below deck. And water would seep below deck, and it would cause, in this case, grain to expand. And so just the creaking of the wind, the waves, the rolling action of the seas might cause the wooden planks to pull apart a bit. So would the wet grain cause it to expand from the inside. So what they would do is they would take ropes, or helps as they call them, and they would drop them over the bow and let them be kind of brought underneath the ship. And so in essence, they would then take these ropes that were dragged underneath, and they would have a side that came up on the right, side that came up on the left, and they would tie them or fasten them. In other words, it was just kind of tightening things down, trying to hold them. What a picture of having difficult times here. It says also that they strake sail, probably meaning what they did is they lowered the main sail, which was the main driving sail. It probably means that they lowered that sail. It probably means that they put up just that little teeny sail on the front. And it also likely means that they dropped what is called a sea anchor into the water. Now, what a sea anchor is a lot like a parachute, but it drags through the water. So you would put this out at the stern. So what you then have is the ship is being driven along by the small sail at the front. It's being slowed down from the rear or the stern by this sea anchor. And this would do two things. It would, first of all, keep the ship pointing in a direction that it's traveling with the wind. At the same time, the sea anchor would slow it down so that you don't go any further than you possibly need to go. Because remember, your goal is to get somewhere, not where you're now being driven. You'll have to make up that later on when the wind finally releases you from its powerful grip. So this is quite an interesting situation. Now, they're being driven along rather rapidly. And so they're concerned because they think they're being driven rather southward. So to them, if you travel long enough in a southward direction, you're going to come along the north coast of North Africa, or the south coast of the Mediterranean. Or in this case, think about it on a modern map as Libya, where there are lots of sandbars. So there's quite a bit of concern that if you're being driven along and you're not under control any better than they are, they could be shipwrecked on a sandbar because this is a big ship that sinks down quite deeply into the water. So they're concerned about all this. Then it reads this way, and we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest or a storm, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our hands, our own hands, the tackling of the ship. So they are very, very concerned here about what's going on. So they begin to lighten the ship, meaning they're throwing the grain overboard. Now that's money that they're throwing overboard, but they want the ship to ride higher and not be so deep in the water. You must lighten it up. Also, of course, it's getting wet down below deck. So it's getting heavier and heavier, and it's sinking deeper and deeper. And if the waves are big, they're crashing over the side many times. Today, when you go boating on the ocean and you're taking water over the bow or over the sides, you call that taking on green water. And you really don't want to do that because your boat will fill up if you can't empty it with pumps. Well, they didn't really necessarily have modern electrical pumps, of course, in those days. So they're throwing the wet grain overboard. Then they began throwing the tackling, all the ropes and the gear and all those kind of things that were used for sailing, extra stuff, in other words. They're throwing it overboard. So you get this idea that it's getting desperate. Isn't that how journeys of life get sometimes? We get desperate, and we wouldn't normally change our life, but when things do get desperate, we begin to wonder, and we begin to jettison certain things in our life. And we don't want to do that, but sometimes conditions are that way. We change jobs. We change people where we hang out with. We change our behavior patterns. We change our church. We change our patterns of life to some different thing, hoping that we're going to do better. We're always wishing that the storm would go away, that we would somehow be able to mitigate and to do much better than we are. It's only natural that we do those kind of things. And sometimes I think God actually wants us to get rid of some of the gear in life. He wants us to get rid of some of the debris in life. He doesn't want us sometimes doing the things we've been doing. He doesn't want us hanging with the people that we've been hanging around with. He wants a change. And so sometimes it takes a tempest. Sometimes it takes a great wind and the risk and the fear of life. And you say to yourself, I hate risk. I hate fear. I hate discomfort. So do we all. But God does use that to get us where He wants us to be. And you can rest assured if you're going through a tempest and a storm right now that God is watching. God knows what's going on. God could deliver you at a moment's notice, but what God is really doing as He brings us from A to B, where He's got us going from A to B, He wants to have change, and He wants to have us sometimes change our lives, and He wants us to travel by faith, even in the difficulty of it all. And believe you me, this is quite a difficulty that these people are going through. So they're lightening things up and things are being thrown overboard. We read in verse 20, and when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, this is quite a storm, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. We have a word that we use for that when we're traveling down the road of life and we kind of get to the point where we see no hope, when we see no ability to make it through. It's called despair. And they had a state of despair. By the way, can you imagine going through the storm and the waves crashing? How sick you would be, how unlikely you were to eat, and how difficult it was managing just the life cycles of everything that you need to do, all on deck, all in the open, getting beaten by the wind and tossed by the waves, and the waves crashing over. So you're wet, you're tired, you're wind driven and broken up with everything that's going on. You give up, though. Where do you go? What do you do? That's a good question, isn't it? But after long abstinence, in other words, it's recognizing the fact that after a long time when we couldn't eat, that's what he's saying here. But after long abstinence, Paul, who had been ignored before, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. You really should have listened. He's not, saying na, 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 sticking his tongue out at them, but he's giving them a truth. He had knowledge, wisdom from God, even in matters of safety like this. Imagine that. God's people are quite a blessing to those around them from time to time. God uses God's own people to bless other people. Now, many of these people aboard the ship, I'm certain, were not Christian people. But, the world to this very day is benefited by Christian people. Where you live your life, even if you're going through a storm, you know that God could use you to benefit people around you. But you do have to get past the storm and the panic of it all. You have to say, God, I believe you that you're watching over me. I believe that you're keeping me as the apple of your eye. I know that nothing is happening to me that you're not aware of. God, I still want to walk by faith, and I still want to be used of you, and maybe even be used of you to minister to other people. That, of course, is getting up a step or two over despair, isn't it? But God will do that. Well, Paul was not one who despaired, but he felt every sorrow, every pain, every difficulty. Make no mistake, God didn't shelter him from any of it. He went through all of it. He says, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer. Cheer up. Easy to say, isn't it? Good cheer. He says this, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. That's kind of a mixed, cheery sound, isn't it? Nobody's going to die, but the ship is going to be lost. I remember talking with a guy who had been on a missionary trip, and they were flying in a small airplane. And the group that was in the plane ran into a great difficulty with turbulence. And they began to wonder if they were going to make it. Well, they finally concluded that, yeah, we're going to make it. But they didn't know if they were going to make it without crashing. That's kind of the same situation here. Well, in their case, they made it without crashing. In this case, they're going to make it. But the ship itself is going to be lost. Paul explains how he comes by this. He said, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve. There's a statement of faith, isn't it? No matter what I'm going through, Paul would say, I listen to God. I heard an angel speak to me tonight because I belong to the Lord and I serve the Lord. Well, friend, I serve the Lord and I belong to the Lord. Hopefully, you understand that about your own circumstance in life. You belong to the Lord. He loves you. He's watching over you. Even if your ship is sinking, even if waves are breaking over the bow, God loves you, and He is your Lord. He is your Savior. Paul really had a sense of that, and what a witness it must have been to those who were beginning to wonder, how's this going down? Are we going to survive this kind of a thing? Is God just going to desert us here? Are we going down for the count? What's going to happen? Well, Paul says we're all going to make it through. All of us, even the soldiers, even the other prisoners, even those who were not willing to listen to Paul previously, all sorts were going to get benefited by just being near this man who believed in God. Paul says, saying, fear not, Paul. This is what this angel said. Saying, fear not, Paul. Thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. So Paul, didn't I tell you, when you think about it, that you're going to appear before Caesar? So despite what you're seeing, despite what's going on, you're going to get to that predetermined position in life. Where I have you going, you're going to get there. The same is true for us. No matter where we are today, where God has intended for us to be today, tomorrow, in the future, we will be there. Period. Isn't it interesting? You think you're guiding your life. You think you're making your own decisions. You think you're the captain of your own ship. But God often shows us that we are not. Nonetheless, where God has us to go, we will arrive safely at that destination. So he's going to go, no matter what, and appear before Caesar. Verse 25, wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. So whether you feel that now or not, Paul's saying, I know. So you can be of good cheer. You're not going to die. You're going to survive. So wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God. Boy, that's the way to be of good cheer, isn't it? I believe God. Do you believe God? Do you believe that God is watching over you? Do you believe that God knows exactly what you're going through? Do you believe that God will safely get you through each trial, each tribulation in life? Do you believe that? If you're losing sight of that, try to stop and say, God, I do put my trust in you. Now, all the tempest of life, the trials, the tribulations, the uncertainties may indeed be as obvious as can be. But in the midst of that, God, I trust you. I put my all in your hands. You feel panicked? You feel at risk? You feel like God is not watching? Say the words, God, out loud if necessary, I put my trust in your hands. My care, my concern is yours. Thank you, Lord, that it is. Perhaps you can say that out loud and then let go and let God. So Paul says, be of good cheer, for I believe God. You know, if you're still fearful, what you're now trying to deal with is believing God. And you can have fear or you can have trust. But it seems that the two don't coexist very well. You seem to have one or the other most of the time. Now, trusting God is called faith. Having fear is what I call unfaith. So cash in your fear and your unfaith and say, I trust you, Lord. Take a deep breath. Open up God's word. Speak to him out loud if necessary. Find a quiet place where it's just you and him. Let the world die down around you and talk to him. As he says here, we're going to do fine because I believe what God has said. Verse 26, howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. We are going to shipwreck. So that's what he says. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, that's the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country or some land. 14 days of this, up and down. So the wind is blowing this way, that way, and they're just being driven wherever the wind takes them. It's about midnight. It's dark. They can't see the stars to navigate by because that's been obscured. What they do learn is they're getting near land. Now, how do they know this? It's nighttime, it's dark. Well, they probably can tell because they're seasoned sailors. Wave conditions change as you draw close to a shore. You probably couldn't feel it. I probably couldn't feel it, but they can. They're trained. But they can also maybe hear in the distance the sound of breaking on shore waves. And so this is what they next do. And they says, and they sounded and found it 20 fathoms. So they would have taken a weight designed for this, a weight on the end of a line. You and I might call it a rope. Generally, when a rope is aboard a ship, it's now called a line. But they would have taken a rope or a line, as they would probably call it. And they would have thrown this weight tied to this rope or this line, and they would have sunk down deep into the water, and they would have been keeping their hands on it so they could tell just when it struck the bottom. Then they would put a mark on that, or if they didn't have a mark on that line, they might have had marks even on it, but they would then see how much line it took to get to the bottom, thereby discovering how deep it was. Today, we would use some kind of a modern depth sounding sonar kind of a thing and would be able to trace it and watch it live time on a screen. But then they did it this way. They did it this way up until very modern times, until some of this electronic gear that we now have is so readily available, even on a small boat that you can fish with off the coast here. Well, this is what they did. They found it 20 fathoms. A fathom is 6 feet, so it's 120 feet. And when they had gone a little further, we read, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms, meaning it's getting more shallow, meaning we're getting closer to shore. Then fearing, of course you start fearing, it says, then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. So they have anchors aboard. These are weights, basically, and they have several of them aboard these ships. They had 4 of them listed off for us here, and they cast them off of the stern or the back of the ship. Now, the reason they do this is because they want to have the front of the ship aiming inward toward the shore so that they can aim it and guide it at least where they want it to go. Of course, they cannot see yet because it's dark. So this is why they're wishing for the sun to come up. So these anchors, weighing perhaps several tons apiece, they weigh a lot, are holding the ship right in place for the time being. And it said, and as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. Explaining here what happens is, there's some guys that decide to just get off this ship. Now, Paul says, we're all going to be okay, we're just going to have to shipwreck. Some of these guys figure it's not going to go well, and so what they do is they get aboard the small boat, the skiff, that had previously been hauled up on top of the ship on the deck. And they act like what they're doing is putting out some anchors and so forth from the front of the ship. This is one way they would do it. You'd put an anchor aboard the smaller skiff, you would row it away, and then you would toss it overboard. That's how they would drop it, rather than dropping it right underneath. They would drop it some distance away. Well, they're looking like they're doing this, but what they're really doing is they're trying to fake everybody out. They're really trying to get aboard the small ship and row away and try to get ashore on their own, safe for them, and who cares about the rest? I mean, that's what they're trying to do. But Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. God has a way of salvation, doesn't he? And there's not a lot of ways. When God provides a way to be saved, that's the way to be saved. So there's kind of a spiritual lesson here from a nautical lesson. And Paul says you can't survive this shipwreck unless you stay aboard this ship for the time being. And so it is, there's one way. And listen to God's man who tells you there is one way for this to happen. Well, then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. So forget that, what these guys are trying. They cut the lines and the boat falls away, presumably without them in it. And there goes that plan. And it says, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat or food, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. So for days they went without eating food, and they were very, very, very weak. You know, I recently had an occasion that was almost the same amount of time. I was sick with COVID a number of months ago. And as it was in my case, I suffered with a constant day-by-day fever and chills routine. Part of the situation was I just couldn't eat. Now, mercifully, my fever broke after 14 days. But during those 12 days, but after those 12 days, I had hardly eaten. I had hardly slept. I just couldn't because I was sick. What I'm saying here is you get weak. And you get to the point where you're getting so weak, you start to wonder if you'll ever have strength again. Well, Paul knew that they would need some strength. And so despite how they feel, and, by this time, you've been sick, you've been barfing, you've been doing all this kind of stuff, and they are weakened. And that sometimes can happen to you. Anyway, my personal account aside, these guys were admonished to take some food. They're going to have to do some swimming, and some work needs to be done. He says, wherefore I pray you, take some meat for this day. This is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. Isn't that interesting? And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. And were they all of good cheer? And they also took some meat. Now I want you to notice something here. It's just an account of what they did, but they're in very uncomfortable, fearful circumstances. They're going to be delivered because God is going to get them safely where they need to go, but it will be through a difficult time and a harrowing time. But they gave thanks. And that's kind of a point I want to make here. When God has us going through the storms of life, and we're not eating, and we're not surviving well, and we're not functioning well, and we're just not getting past our difficulty, when we finally decide to trust God, we can stop in the midst of it. Doesn't matter how scary it looks, doesn't matter how difficult the current situation really is. There's a time where we take refreshment for our bodies and refreshment for our inner being, and we give thanks to God, not for the circumstance that we're in, but despite the circumstance that we're in. Maybe you're needing to get aside with this Bible study today and say, God, I want to thank you. God, I know that you're going to get me where you want me to be, and all is going to be not just well, but I'm going to be where you want me to be. Maybe you've been trying to guide your own ship, and it hasn't worked out so well, but God will get you where he wants you to be. It will be smooth sailing soon enough. Maybe there'll be a shipwreck before, but you know what? Trust God and give him thanks. And they all did, and they all felt better, even the ones that were not of the faith, interestingly enough. And it says, and we were in all in the ship, 216 souls. Wow, that's a lot of people, isn't it? When you wonder how big these ships were, that's 276 people on deck surviving this whole thing. It says, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. So they know they're going to crash against the shore. They want to get as far toward the dry shore as they can. The ship needs to be lightened as much as it can to ride as high as it can out of the water so that they can do that. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek or a bay with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. From what they could see, by the way, it's a one-way journey. You don't get to turn around. It looks like there's a possible place to go. And when they had taken up the anchors, remember those anchors that they had beyond on the stern, they committed themselves unto the sea, loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore. Now, they didn't have rudders on a rudder post like we have today on many a sailing ship or other power ships for that matter. That hadn't been invented yet. They had an oar on the right and an oar on the left. They had tied them so they wouldn't be flopping around. Now they loose them because they're going to use those to try to guide where they go. And they lift the mainsail up, so they're going to try to make it as fast and as far into the dry shore as they can. And falling into a place where the two seas met, there's kind of a way that seas are kind of crashing this way and that way. They ran the ship aground here, and the forepart stuck fast. So the nose of the boat, the front of the boat, the bow got there first, and it just stuck right in the sand or the rocks, whatever it was, and remained unmovable. It was stuck. But the hinder part, the back, the stern, was broken with the violence of the waves. It's still pitching up and down. And so this is a recipe for, in a short time, the whole thing is going to be dashed to pieces and broken apart. But not quite immediate. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. In those days, if you lost a prisoner, you paid with your life if you were a soldier guarding them. And so they figure that under the circumstances, they have but one choice. Let's go ahead and kill them. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose. So once again, other people were benefited by having this Christian man, Paul, aboard, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. So jump overboard and take a swim. And that's what was said to them if they knew how to swim. And the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to the land. Well, I feel like I want to take a deep breath after such a harrowing journey. And I wonder what it would be like if someone were to make a video or a film or a movie of this whole thing. Surely it would have lots of drama. But life often does, doesn't it? Well, next time we're going to see them ashore. Eventually, we're going to see Paul make it to Rome. That's going to all be in chapter 28. Thanks for being on board, and thanks for hopefully enjoying this journey as we've sailed with Paul through the trials and tribulations of actual sailing. Thanks for being here. God bless you, and bye for now.